It wasn't telling me we were live, but we are, for all intents and purposes, live. So thank you guys for joining me. It has been quite a week. Not a bad week. But it has been quite a week. For those who were here last Wednesday, I was talking about how Hen Wolf had just, gotten her surgery, and she's doing very well. We're now 7 days out from the surgery, and she's pretty much recovered. Now we wait one more week to get the cone off. And that dog has smacked that cone into everything in her path. She's knocked over television trays. She's knocked off everything on the coffee table. And this is just from her being a brutish juggernaut that storms and stomps through my house with reckless abandon. But without the cone, Hen Wolf is a bizarrely swift creature. She has a strange amount of control, and she's like a ballerina and a rhinoceros combined. But with the cone, it's a bit worse. And she never wants to back out from the cone hitting something. She just forces it harder. So she's doing well, even though the cone is frustrating her. And I will say, I can't wait to take a picture of the cone and show it to everybody on Facebook, because it's got just stress fractures all over it from all of the damage she's put it through. And this is without her even trying to take it off, by the way. So, just wanted to mention that. Also, I want to say really quick, big thank you to Craig Cohen and Ray Cersei. In that order, Craig won this week's battle to be the first donor, and Ray came in about 4 minutes later and contributed. So thank you guys so much for your tips and for your enthusiasm. I do appreciate it very, very much. Let's see what's going on in the chat. Craig Cohen, who I was just talking about, said, "Hello, Henrik. Good evening." Good evening to you, my man. Morgan Moore said, "Greetings, everyone." I also implore this greeting as well. Heather Fairchild, hey, hey. Hello, Heather. Shane Migliavaca, yeah, boy. Thank you, Shane. Ray Cersei, hello, everyone. Shane said, "Glad she's doing better." Yes, Hen Wolf is doing well. It's just the cones are something. They are, yeah. She's handling it well. She'll be just fine, but you know, let's see, Ray Cersei, man, so close. Linda Powell said, "Love you, Ricky." Well, thank you so much. It has been, I feel like it's been forever since someone called me Ricky. Oh, Alex Harker said, "Hello, hello." So, my friends, are we ready on this warm summer night, or near summer night, to do a little scary stories? Because I think that's what's up. I think it's time. We've got one story left in Super Scary Stories for Sleepovers. And then once we're done with that, the mystery book. I know it's one of the Scary Story for Sleepover books, but I don't know which one. I think I have 2 or 3 more that are still wrapped in their packaging. So the mystery book will come next, and I really don't know which one it is. So, let's see. All right. Here we go, my friends. A little campfire story enjoyment. All right. This story is called Horror in the Center Ring. Paul slammed his locker door, and Martin raised his eyebrows looking at his friend. "What's bothering you?" he asked. "My mom said I can't go to the pool party at Tara's house on Saturday because my room's a mess," Paul said in disgust. "I have to spend Saturday cleaning it." "That's the pits," Martin said sympathetically. "It's your room. You should be able to keep it any way you want. My dad is always on my case. Do this, do that." "All parents ever do is nag," Paul grumbled. "It seems like I never do anything right. I ought to just leave home. Then I could do whatever I want." "Yeah," Martin agreed. "That would be great, but where could we go? We'd have to get jobs or something." Paul studied the floor thoughtfully. "I don't know. Yet. But I'll think of something. I'd do anything to be out on my own. Over the next 2 weeks, Paul and Martin talked of nothing but what they would do if they left home. "Look," Martin said excitedly as they walked to school one morning, pulling a folded bright yellow flyer from his pocket and waving it in the air. Paul grabbed the paper, opened it, and read the heading aloud. "Old World Circus. See exotic animals from all over the globe, thrilled to death-defying acts." He turned and looked quizzically at Martin. "Sounds okay, but so what?" "Think about it," Martin answered, tapping the side of his head with his finger. "Last year I read a book about a kid who ran away and joined the circus. It's perfect. No school, and it's like an unwritten rule or something in the circus that nobody asks any questions." Paul glanced down and saw that the opening day parade was scheduled for that weekend. "They'll be in town for 3 days," Martin continued. "And I say that when they leave, we go with them." "Oh, come on," Paul said skeptically. "They're not going to take us. They could get in trouble." "Not if we hide out in one of their vans," Martin assured him. "We could sneak in at night. By the time they find us, we'll be a zillion miles from this crummy place. Maybe I could even learn to be a lion tamer. I'd love to be in an act like that with big cats." Paul reread the flyer. "Well," he said, nodding, "at least we can check it out." And so, on Saturday morning, Paul and Martin rode their bikes to Main Street early. They found a good spot close to the curb and waited with expectation for the circus parade the flyer had mentioned. Before long, dozens of other happy spectators joined them, and soon afterward, the merry sound of approaching calliope music blended with the buzz of the crowd. "Look! Look, an elephant!" a little girl squealed delightedly. Paul craned his neck to see the huge animal rounding the corner at the end of the block. The enormous creature was wearing a colorful cape with spangles that glittered in the sun. On its head was a cap topped with tall, fluffy feathers. Behind the elephant was a parade of masked performers, clowns, and several costumed people on tall stilts. "Wow," Martin exclaimed as the lion and tiger cages approached. "Look at that!" The impressive cats roared threateningly at the crowd. The beasts paced back and forth, seemingly upset and anxious. Riding atop one of the cages was a man dressed in a black silk tuxedo. He had a top hat and a long, dark cape lined with crimson silk, the color of blood. In his hand he held a whip, which he cracked now and then. Paul stared in awe at the man, who, as he passed in front of the boys, turned and gave them a knowing grin. "He must be the ringmaster," Martin commented. "This is the coolest thing I've ever seen," Paul exclaimed, watching as the elephants led the parade on its way to the fairgrounds. "I'd do anything to be a part of the circus. Do you really think we could just—" All at once, a shadow fell across the two boys, and Paul became silent. He turned to see a tall clown leaning over him and Martin. In spite of his painted-on smile, the clown seemed more menacing than funny. He held out a silvery helium balloon to Paul. "Is that for me?" Paul asked apprehensively. The clown didn't answer. He simply smiled, wider, exposing a row of sparkling white teeth. Slowly, Paul reached up to take the balloon. "Whoa!" he blurted out, jerking his hand back and letting go of the string. The icy-cold touch of the clown's long fingers had taken him by surprise. Looking up, he watched as the balloon escaped, floating higher and higher into the air. The clown backed away and took his place in the parade. "What was that about?" Martin asked. "I'm not sure," Paul answered, trying to rub the clown's chill from his fingers. That night, Paul was awakened by the sound of his mother's worried voice on the telephone. He listened carefully, but only caught snatches of the conversation. "How long?" he heard his mom ask. "No, I haven't. He's asleep. I'll ask him. Don't worry. I'm sure he won't go far. You can't blame yourself. I'll call you back." Paul shut his eyes and pretended to be asleep as his mom opened his bedroom door. "Paul?" she said gently. He didn't move. "Paul?" she said a little louder. "Please wake up. It's about Martin." Paul opened his eyes and asked, "What about Martin?" His mother seemed worried. "I just spoke to his dad. It seems that they had a big fight tonight and now Martin is missing. His backpack is gone too. Do you have any idea where he might be? Has he said anything to you about running away?" "No," Paul lied. He tried hard to keep his voice as steady as possible. "I don't know anything." "Are you sure?" his mom asked again. "This is really important. His parents are frantic." "I said I don't know," Paul mumbled, rolling over and pretending to go back to sleep. As soon as his mom left his room, he jumped up and pulled on his jeans, a sweatshirt, and a pair of sneakers. He had already prepared his backpack with snacks, bottled water, and some extra clothes. This wasn't the plan, he grumbled to himself as he slipped out of his bedroom window and headed for the fairgrounds. What is Martin doing? He's going to mess everything up. The circus grounds seemed eerily quiet. Paul slipped into the main tent and looked around. "Martin," he called out in a harsh whisper, but his voice echoed off of the empty stands. "How am I supposed to find him now?" Paul muttered, backing toward the exit. Then, all at once, he felt himself gripped powerfully at the shoulders. "I thought you might be along soon to join your friend." Paul twisted around to look into the shadowy face of the ringmaster from the parade. "Is Martin here?" Paul asked in a shaky voice. "Indeed," the man said, releasing his hold. "We always welcome runaways. In fact," he added, in a sinister tone, "they are very, very important to this particular circus." The ringmaster leaned in toward Paul. "So what is it, my boy? Parents don't understand you? A problem with school? No matter. We have a place for you here. I think you'll fit in quite well." Paul noticed movement behind the ringmaster and saw that 3 other performers had entered the tent. The odd clown from the parade was among them. I've changed my mind," he said fearfully. "I want to go home." "I'm afraid it's too late for that," the ringmaster laughed coldly, then reached out for him. "No!" Paul shouted, dodging to the side of the ringmaster. Managing to evade the scowling clown and the others, he raced from the tent. But when he got to the exit, he saw that it was now blocked by several creepy-looking circus performers. He quickly pressed himself into the shadows along the tent, almost tasting the fear that was welling up inside of him. Then, looking from left to right, he made a dash for the shelter of the funhouse wall. He took cover behind a large decorative cage parked beside the wall. Nearby, the low rumble of a lion gave him chills. His only thought was of getting away from this terrible place and back to safety of his own home. Once he was there, he would never complain about anything again, and he'd keep his room sparkling clean. All at once, Paul heard his name being called softly. It was his friend's voice, but it sounded strangely different, altered, as if Martin were having trouble forming the words. "Martin, where are you?" Paul demanded. "Here," the deep foreign-sounding voice responded from the cage behind him. Paul turned cautiously, and then he felt as if the world had suddenly flipped upside down. There in front of him was his best friend. Changed, transformed into some sort of horrifying mutant, half tiger, half human. "Martin?" Paul croaked, barely able to recognize his friend. Where Martin had once had hands and feet, he now had large paws tipped with gleaming black talons. His face was covered with coarse orange and black fur, and his extended snout ended in a mouth filled with sharp, ivory-colored teeth. "You've got to get away while you still can and get help. It's our only hope," Martin moaned. "The ringmaster has some sort of power. He'll do it to you too," he warned, holding out his large paws. "The ringmaster?" Paul asked, staring at his friend with a mixture of fascination and horror. "But how did he do this to you?" "I don't know for sure," Martin said. "But whatever you do, don't put on..." He stopped abruptly and shrank back in fear. "They're coming!" Martin shrieked, retreating to the back of his cage. "Hide!" Without hesitation, Paul darted through the curtained entrance to the funhouse. It was dully lit inside by tiny bulbs along the floor that led the way through the gloomy corridor. Slowly, carefully, Paul edged along, straining to hear if anyone was coming after him. Then, turning a corner, he suddenly came face to face with dozens of mirror images of himself, all grotesque and distorted. Choking back a scream, he put out his hands and pressed his fingers against the glass, trying to feel for an exit out of this horrible place. Dripping with sweat caused by fear and the hot, stagnant air surrounding him, Paul felt as if he would suffocate if he didn't escape soon. All around him were deformed apparitions of himself trapped in the mirrors reflecting his panic, which grew as he heard the sounds of someone entering the funhouse and moving deliberately toward him. Hurrying along, Paul suddenly stumbled through an unmirrored archway and into a small room that appeared to be used for storage. He looked around for a good hiding place, but saw only disorderly piles of clothing, masks, and props. In desperation, he burrowed under a mound of silky costumes, but found that there wasn't enough to cover him, and the sound of footsteps was getting closer. What am I going to do? His mind raced, near hysteria. Then he noticed an elaborate mask. With only seconds to spare, he slipped it over his head so that he was completely concealed. Holding his breath, he remained perfectly still as someone stepped into the room, apparently looked around, and left. Breathing a sigh of relief, Paul slid from his hiding place and tried to pull the confining mask from his head. But it wouldn't budge. Clawing at it in growing terror, he stumbled back into the Hall of Mirrors. From dozens of different angles, he saw himself with the ferocious head of a tiger. "No!" he screamed, running through the dark corridor as the mask burned into his skin. Once outside, Paul found himself surrounded by a dozen glaring performers. "Get it off of me!" he screamed to them. "Please, get it off!" But the words were difficult for Paul to form with the long, sharp teeth that were emerging from his growing snout, and they came out sounding deep and foreign. The ringmaster stepped forward and grabbed him by the arm. "Your new home is ready," the man announced with a sneer. He twisted Paul around to look at the cage that had once held his best friend. Now a wild tiger paced back and forth. "You and your friend wanted to join the circus," the ringmaster snarled. "Well, you got your wish." He shoved Paul roughly into the cage with what was once Martin. "Now you boys play nicely," he laughed cruelly. "You're going to be together for a very long time." You know, in all these books, we hadn't made it to the circus yet. So I think it was just about time. Let's see what you guys are saying. Oh, thank you so much, Shane Migliavaca and Jeff McClellan, for your tips. I do appreciate it. You know, tipping is not required, but it is appreciated. So let's see what you guys are saying in the chat. I'm just like trying to scroll back and I'm already laughing at your guys' comments. Brian Emerson, yo dude. Hey Brian, if you're still in here, good to see you, man. Hope your night is going very well. Alexandra Harker, what if it's the same one, LOL. I'm guessing she's talking about what the mystery book is. I am paranoid that it's going to be the same book, but I ordered 7 books. When the stream first started, I ordered all 7 of the Scary Story for Sleepover books that I didn't already own, but I didn't open them. I just kept them in the packaging because I thought it was more exciting that way. Ray Cersei, sounds circusy. Morgan Moore, let's see, circus or wrestling? Circus it is. Shane Migliavaca, will it be evil clowns? In part. Ray Cersei, oh clowns, shudder. Morgan Moore, I get the feeling the runaways get fed to the lions. Close. Shane Migliavaca, Mr. Dark? Ray Cersei, those boys gonna be dinner. Keith Tomlin, isn't creepy circus worker redundant? That's a good point. Ray Cersei, what the stinking heck? Morgan Moore, this Animorphs spinoff is creepy. Animorphs. Shane Migliavaca said, the ringmaster, by God, it's Stone Cold! That's an old school wrestling reference for those who don't know. Ray Cersei said, creepy. Craig Cohen said, circus horror is great. I would have to agree. And Brian Emerson said, well done, dude. Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. Aw, Alex Harker said, LOL. And, and Brian said, story time with my cigar. Very nice. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Well, let's find out what the next book is. It's time, my friends. I like how it's like, oh dear, this one we might not be able to read. Or I get, this one's different than the other ones. I may have to open up another package. Because this, I've heard about this one, but I obviously didn't have it before. But this is actually the final book they released. This is the Scary Stories for Sleepovers Almanac. The description of it is If you love to be scared, then the Scary Stories for Sleepovers Almanac is for you. Based on the best-selling Scary Stories for Sleepovers series, this compendium of all true terror contains ghastly ghost stories, mesmerizing tales of the strange and frightening facts on monsters and other creepy creatures. Also included are loads of helpful hints on putting together the scariest and most fun sleepover your friends have ever experienced. So this one is actually an almanac for your scary stories, and it looks pretty fun. But Morgan Moore said, it's Vader time. Let me grab another one of the books real quick. I know I should have put them closer. Let's see. I can't remember if we read this one or not. This one is more Scary Stories for Sleepovers. Did we read this? I apologize. I should have been more prepared. Well, what do you guys think? Do you want me to read the almanac, or do you want me... I could read through the almanac if you want. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Either the almanac or what is in this magic bag. This is the last package I haven't opened. Oh, dear. Okay. Still more Scary Stories for Sleepovers. That, my friends, is what's up. All right, let's do this guy. The almanac sounds a little too... maybe that'll be the season finale. All right. Let's see what we got here. All right, quick drink of water and we'll jump right in. This story, my friends, is called The Knight of Ki Quan. The moment he saw the package wrapped in brown paper on the dining room table, Matthew knew where it was from. First of all, it was a Friday, and the packages always arrived on Fridays. They were always wrapped with coarse, strong twine, too. He set his schoolbooks on the table and lifted the heavy box. His name was neatly lettered in his mother's clear handwriting. "So you found it." Matthew looked up. His grandmother was standing in the kitchen doorway, smiling. "Yes, Gran," he said. "It feels like there's a lot of stuff in this one. I can't wait to get a look at what's inside." Matthew was very proud of his mother. She was a scientist, an anthropologist who studied the traditions of Native American peoples. For the past 3 years, his mom had spent several weeks each spring in the mountains near the site of an ancient village studying the history of a small, mysterious tribe of Choctaw people. Twice a month, she would send home a package of notes and objects that local people had given her to help with her work. Matthew wanted to be an anthropologist too when he grew up. Each year when she came home, his mother had allowed Matthew to help her as she organized the material that she'd collected on her trip. This year, he was entrusted with the job of opening each package and checking to see that everything had arrived in order. "Well, aren't you going to open it?" Gran asked. Matthew tugged the twine away, tore through the paper, and opened the box. Inside, there was a flat stone for grinding grain, a beaded necklace decorated with feathers, and a pipe carved from a single piece of grayish wood. Everything had been labeled, and Matthew checked each item against a list his mother had enclosed, but he was more interested in 2 spiral notebooks in the bottom of the box. These contained his mother's notes. She had been collecting stories from the descendant of a tribal medicine man, and some of them were pretty scary. Matthew sat down and opened the first book. It was mostly about the kids of dwellings the Choctaw had built when they first settled in the mountains. When he opened the second book, he let out a low whistle. Tucked into the front was a colored pencil drawing of a strange-looking creature. The body, tall and muscular, looked human, almost normal, except that it had very long fingers and toes tipped with savage-looking curved claws. But the head sent a chill right through him. It was large and wolfish. Double rows of long, pointed teeth lined the open jaws. At the front, a pair of dagger-like fangs overlapped the lower jaw. Black fur covered the creature's head and neck and ended like a shaggy collar over its shoulders. It was the eyes, though, that really caught Matthew's attention. They were wide and fiery red, with a thin slit of black at the centers. He looked at the drawing from different angles, but the eyes always seemed to be looking right at him. The first page in the notebook explained that the beast was a type of legendary creature called the Ki Quan. Matthew read on about the legend of the creature. "Cool," he said under his breath when he'd finished reading. "This'll be perfect for tonight." His grandmother had returned to the kitchen. Matthew checked to see checked to see that she was out of hearing range. Then he picked up the telephone and punched in a number. After a couple of rings, his friend Joey answered. "Joey, I got a package today," Matthew said softly. "Matt, is that you? How come you're whispering? I can hardly hear you." Matt raised his voice a little. "I can't talk any louder. My grandmother is in the kitchen. I got a package and it's got a good story in it. Looks really creepy. You want to call the guys and tell them we're going to meet at the clearing?" Joey sounded hesitant. "I don't know, Matt. I almost got caught sneaking back in last time." "Oh, come on. Sneaking out is part of the fun," goaded Matthew. "The legend is about wolf people that devour their victims and chomp their bones into tiny bits." The line was silent for another moment. Then Joey croaked. "Wolf people? With red eyes and long, sharp claws," Matthew coaxed. "Okay, count me in," Joey said. "I'll call the rest of the guys. See you at midnight." At 11:30 that night, Matthew left his room, tiptoed past his snoring grandmother, and slipped out the front door. He ran to the end of his block and then turned uphill, into the woods. He had a small flashlight with him, but he really didn't need it. The moon was full and he could have found his way to the clearing blindfolded. Matthew and his friends Joey, Link, Ron, and Zach had formed the Terror Society a year ago. At least once a month, they met at the clearing to tell scary stories. They'd even tried to hold seances a couple of times to conjure up spirits of the dead. At first, Matt hadn't been very good at storytelling because he had a hard time making things up, but then he started telling the tales of the medicine man that he read in his mom's notes. Everyone got really scared. Now they met whenever a package arrived that contained a new tale of fright. As he neared the meeting place, Matthew could see a glimmer of light through the trees. He stepped into the clearing and saw that the others were already hunched around a small fire. Smiling to himself, Matthew decided to really set the stage for his story. "That's right," he said aloud. He was pleased that the other boys jumped when he spoke. "Stay as close to the fire as you can, because it is the only thing they fear. It is the only thing that can protect you from them." From who? Zach faked being frightened. He was really into it. Matthew slowly approached the fire and stretched out his hands to warm them. He looked into the eyes of each boy one at a time, then spoke in a hushed tone. "The Ki Quan. They roam these very woods, hungry and thirsty, looking for a meal of tender human flesh and thirst-quenching blood. With the cunning of an animal and the cruelty of a human, they stalk helpless victims and tear them to shreds, even cracking open their bones to reach the marrow inside." His audience was hooked. Matthew continued on with the legend, adding a few frightening details of his own. When he had finished, he paused for effect, then pulled his mother's drawing from his pocket. "Behold, the face of the Ki Quan!" It was a little dramatic, but it worked. Everyone gasped. In the firelight, the red eyes of the beast seemed to glitter. Then all the boys broke out in nervous laughter. They took turns looking at the frightful drawing. Zach shivered. "I'm not so sure I want to cut back through the woods if these guys are out there." "Don't worry," Matthew assured him. "They only hunt at night, under the cover of fog. And as you can see," he said, gesturing toward the full moon, "this doesn't seem to be their kind of night." Even so, the boys all walked back through the woods together and didn't split up until they were near their homes. 2 weeks later, another package arrived. Matthew was disappointed that there were no more stories, but he did find another notebook. The handwriting was tiny and irregular, nothing like his mother's, and the pages were filled with what seemed to be instructions. Some of the words were odd-sounding, but he did recognize a name. Ki Quan. It was repeated several times. Matthew read over the scrawled instructions a couple of times, then suddenly realized what it was. It was a spell to conjure up Ki Quan. The whole book was filled with spells. This time, Matthew had no trouble at all convincing Joey to slip out. He simply told him that he had something better than a scary story. He had a notebook full of magic spells. That night, Matthew was so excited and anxious to try one of the spells that he was the first to arrive in the clearing. He took some time to gather up a pile of dry wood and started a fire. One by one, the others arrived. Link had brought along some face paint. "I thought it would help the ritual," he explained, smearing a bold blue stripe on his cheek. The boys laughed and kidded each other as they painted their faces with lines and dots of color. Finally, Joey stood in front of the flickering fire and called the group to order. "It's time," he said. The preparations are complete. We must choose a spell." The other boys snickered, but then they played along and set their faces in somber expressions. Then Ron turned to Matthew. "What are our choices?" "As far as I can tell," Matthew answered, "the easiest ones are bringing rain and finding an underground spring." Zach laughed out loud. "Oh, great. Don't you have anything for finding treasure or something?" "Nope," Matthew said, still flipping through the notebook. "That's it. The others look kind of dangerous." "Then it's rain," Link suggested. "That'll be more fun than having to dig a well." The boys agreed and began to follow the instructions in the notebook word for word. They chanted the spell together and moved around the fire in a kind of clumsy dance until Joey stopped them. "Quiet," he demanded. They all stood perfectly still. "Did you hear that?" "It sounded like thunder." "You're hearing things," Link laughed and elbowed his friend. "Look," he said, pointing up. "There isn't a cloud in the sky. Besides, I'm tired of this. What else is in the book? Isn't there anything scary?" Matthew looked from one boy to the next. He didn't want to disappoint his friends. "Well, there is one thing. But it sounds too scary to me." "What is it?" Ron asked. Matthew bit his lower lip and hesitated. He wasn't really sure anymore that he wanted to do this. What if it worked? "Well," he said, "there is a spell to call the Ki Quan." At first, no one spoke. Then Joey broke the silence. "You mean those wolf monsters? Why would we want to bring them around here?" Suddenly, Link laughed. "Oh, come on, guys. This stuff doesn't really work. It's just a goof. It's for fun. Let's do the spell." Joey wasn't convinced. What if this stuff does work? Link looked at his friend. "We've been doing a rain dance for 15 minutes. Are we wet?" Everyone laughed. Link was right. "Let's do it," they shouted. Then they huddled around the fire and carefully recited each part of the spell for the Ki Quan. Nothing happened. "Maybe we ought to dance around for this one too," Ron joked and whirled around. As the other boys laughed, he whirled faster, then tripped and tumbled toward the fire. He fell heavily. "Are you okay?" Matthew asked. "Yeah," Ron sat up. He held his hand out toward the fire. "I think I might have cut my hand on that piece of wood, though." A drop of blood formed on the side of Ron's hand and dripped onto one of the heated rocks that ringed the fire pit. As it hit, the blood splattered and sizzled. A tiny puff of steam rose from the rock and swirled toward the woods. As the boys watched, the puff expanded and developed into a dense fog. "What's going on?" Joey sounded frightened. I don't know," Matthew said. "Maybe we should go." But before they could take a step, there was a rustling sound in the woods. The boys backed up toward the fire. In the deepening fog, they could see dozens of pairs of glowing red eyes. "It's them," Ron moaned in terror. "It's the Ki Quan! We've brought them here!" A deep, vicious snarl rose from the shadows. "What are we going to do?" Joey was almost in tears. "Does it say anything about how to make them go away?" Matthew flipped through the book. I don't see anything," he said, beginning to panic. Then suddenly he remembered something. "But the first legend said that they won't come near a fire. We have to keep the fire going. There's plenty of wood. If we can keep the fire going until sunrise, we can hold them off." "That's right," Joey sounded hopeful. "I remember you said something about that. All we have to do is..." he suddenly stopped. "Listen," he whispered. "Oh no," Link groaned. "It worked! That stupid rain dance, it worked!" The thunder rolled again, and as the first drops of rain splattered down, the fire sputtered, dimmed, and left them alone in the thickening fog. Oh man, that one got me goosebumped. Yeah, that's always the goal. If a story can get me goosebumped, I mean, I'm reading it. That is important. So, Shane Migliavaca said, awesome, I just got this one in the mail Monday. These are fun to get, and most of them are not expensive, although I did want to mention the final book, number 10, the one before the Almanac, I am having trouble finding it for less than $50 when the rest of them were like $5. So I'm debating if I want to drop that kind of coin or not. Let's see. Michelle, Terror Society at midnight. No copyright infringement involved. They mostly come out at night. Mostly. That's what Shane Migliavaca said. Dwayne West said, "I'm all tuned in, my friend. Good to have you here, Dwayne." And Morgan Moore said, "It gonna rain." And you were not wrong. Oh, and thank you so much, Keith Tomlin, for your tip. I very much appreciate it. Let's see what we got going on. Looks like everything's good. All right. So that was a pretty fun one. I think the book is starting off strong, and that's a good thing. So, let's see. I just want to make sure my throat is not too dried out, because I'm sure we got some more good ones to get to in here. Here we go, my friends. Fresh story for you. This one is called A Special Pair. "She's gonna love this," Alex said excitedly as he and his dad set up the hamster habitat, complete with a large, bright yellow exercise wheel. Alex opened the box from the pet store and scooped up 2 identical hamsters with reddish gold and snowy white fur. The gifts that Alex and Amy exchanged on their shared birthday were always in pairs. It was their own special way to celebrate being twins. "This," Alex said with certainty, "is the best idea I've come up with yet." He covered the habitat with a sheet of red wrapping paper and punched small holes in the top to provide plenty of air for the little animals. Then, his dad helped him to place the gift on a table in the family room. The children had a hard time being patient during dinner. Alex was very curious about the package that Amy had brought home with her. Finally, after the table had been cleared, it was time to open the gifts. Amy opened her present first. "Oh, Alex," she squealed as she looked at the furry creature. "They're adorable!" She picked up both of her fluffy pets at once and looked them in the eyes. "I will call you Castor and you Pollux," she informed the wriggling animals, "after the twins we read about in Greek mythology." Alex rolled his eyes and Amy rolled hers back. "Just open your present," she said. Alex ripped open his gift. His eyes sparkled as he read the label on the box. "Walkie-talkies! Thanks!" They run on batteries," Amy pointed out. "We can use them anywhere." Within a week, Amy had taught both hamsters to come to her when she made a special whistling sound, and Alex had become an expert with the walkie-talkies. At night, the twins kept the walkie-talkie units in their bedrooms and whispered jokes and secrets until they fell asleep. They were grateful to have them when Mrs. Bragg left and the new babysitter arrived. "Why isn't Mrs. Bragg going to stay with us?" Amy asked, watching her mother snap her suitcase shut. "Mrs. Bragg has a new grandson. She's gone to stay with her daughter and help for a few weeks. But this sitter is highly recommended. I've already had a nice long talk with her. I'm sure you'll like her." "I'm sure we will," Amy said, trying to convince herself. "Besides, you and Dad'll only be gone for the weekend." But Amy wasn't quite as sure of herself when the new sitter arrived. The woman's name was Clara. Crouched at the top of the stairs, Amy and Alex watched as Clara marched into the house. The twins looked at each other, and without a word, they decided they didn't like her. "Alex, Amy," her mom called. "Come here, please." Slowly they made their way down the stairs. They stood, looking up at the intruder. "This is Clara," their mother said. "She will stay with you while we are gone. Now, be good kids and do as she says. I'm counting on you." Clara looked from one twin to the other. She seemed very pleased. "Oh, I'm sure we'll get along just fine, Mrs. Rogers. You have no idea how glad I am to meet this special pair." Her eyes glittered so wickedly that Alex gasped. He looked at his mother to see whether she had noticed it too. But she was already double-checking her list to be sure she hadn't forgotten anything. A moment later, after hugs and a last-minute search for the camera, their parents were gone. Amy and Alex were all alone with Clara, who smiled crookedly and raised one eyebrow. "Now, why don't we get to know one another a little better? Let's sit down and you can tell me all about yourselves." Before bedtime, the twins watched their favorite television show, but Clara paid little attention to the screen. She stared boldly at the children. Alex, trying to be nice, offered her some of the buttery popcorn he had made. "No," she said, waving it away. "I'm on a special diet. But you two go ahead and fill up. There's nothing sweeter than a pair of plump youngsters." Alex glanced sideways at Amy. His expression said, "Is she weird or what?" He placed the bowl back on the table without watching what he was doing. "Look out!" Amy cried, but it was too late. The bowl clanked against her half-empty soda glass and toppled it to the floor. The glass cracked in several large pieces. Alex leaned over to pick up, then pulled back his hand. "Ouch! I cut my finger!" Clara grabbed at his hand. Her eyes were fiery. "Is it bleeding? Let me see." "It's okay," Alex said. He tried to pull his hand away, but Clara held on tightly. With a paper napkin, she dabbed at the tiny cut. Alex squirmed in her grasp. "Let me go!" The sitter seemed to gain control of herself. "I'm sorry, I just didn't expect such a..." The excited expression on her face rearranged itself into something resembling concern. "Such an unfortunate accident. Perhaps it is time that you two went to bed. I'll clean up this mess, then I'm going to take my evening walk. Don't worry, I'll be back before you know it." "She's so creepy," Amy whispered to Alex as the twins slowly climbed upstairs. "I think she's up to something." "That's silly," Alex said, but as he glanced back, he saw Clara slip the blood-stained napkin into her pocket. Alex didn't know how long he'd been asleep when he heard his sister's frightened voice. "Alex, can you hear me?" "Amy?" He picked up his walkie-talkie unit. "What's wrong?" "She's right outside the door. What should I do?" Alex thought quickly. "Don't let her know you're awake. Just see what happens. If she tries to hurt you, I'll stop her." Through the walkie-talkie he heard Amy's shallow breathing as her bedroom door creaked open. He slipped out of bed and tiptoed across the room. Gripping the handle of his baseball bat, he opened his door just a crack and scanned the darkened hallway. A shadow stepped from Amy's room, and then Alex heard footsteps retreating down the stairs. He rushed into his sister's room. "Amy, are you all right?" "Yeah, but it's so odd. She took my hairbrush. What do you suppose she wants with that?" Alex tapped one finger against his lips. He thought about the blood-stained napkin, and now this. It sounded like voodoo or something, but that was crazy. "Look," he finally whispered, "I think I should search your room. We'll wait until tomorrow, then you make up some excuse to get her away from the house." "I don't know if that's such a good idea," Amy said. "Do you have a better one?" The following morning, Alex was shaken awake. Amy was leaning over him. "Castor and Pollux are gone," she said. "I've looked for them everywhere, but I can't find them." Alex tried to calm his sister. "They're probably somewhere in the house. I'll help you look." Amy turned to leave. "Wait!" Alex exclaimed. "That's it! You asked Clara to help you look for Castor and Pollux outside while I look in the house. That'll give me a chance to see if anything is suspicious in her room." "Okay," Amy agreed. "I'll ask her right now." Alex dressed and hurried downstairs in time to see Amy and Clara go out to the backyard. He went straight to Clara's room and quietly opened the door. At first, nothing caught his attention, but then his gaze fell on a tuft of reddish gold and white fur on the floor. He picked it up and examined it. Hamster fur? Alex made the special whistling sound that Amy had taught the hamsters to respond to. Something chattered from within the closet, and Alex moved toward the sound. Slowly, he reached for the knob. His fingers had just touched it when the door to the bedroom flew open. Alex whirled and came face to face with Clara. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded. I was looking for Castor and Pollux, Amy's hamsters. I thought I heard them," he cringed as Clara leaned in close to him. "They're not here," she said. "But I'm sure I heard they're not here," she said firmly. Alex glanced at the closet door. "I must have made a mistake," he lied. He left quickly and went to his room. Moments later, Amy knocked at the door and slipped in. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "No," Alex said sourly. "You were supposed to keep her outside for a while and give me some time." Amy looked at him strangely. "I did, Alex. Clara has been outside with me all of this time." "Oh, right. Then why did she walk in while I was in her room and scare me to death?" Amy took her brother's arm and steered him to the window. "Alex, Clara has been outside with me. She's still out there." Alex looked down to see Clara searching among the bushes in the yard. "Then how did she... I don't know what's going on here, but if she's up to something, she's going to have to make her move tonight, and Mom and Dad will be home tomorrow. I think the answer is in her closet. She sure didn't want me to look in there. Tonight we'll have to figure out a way to see what she's hiding." All day long, the twins kept a close eye on Clara. Finally, after dinner, Clara announced that she was going to take her evening walk. The twins watched her leave. Alex rushed to the door and locked it. "There, now she won't be able to sneak in on us." Smiling, he held up a key that glittered in the light from the hall. "I took this from her coat pocket this afternoon. Now come on, this may be our only chance to find out what she's up to." The children made their way to the guest room at the back of the house. A dull reddish light shone on the carpet at the base of the slightly open door. Alex and Amy crept as close as they dared and peered into Clara's room. Bathed in a faint red glow, it appeared to be empty. Alex stepped into the room and halted. Two children, a boy and a girl, stood gazing out the open window. Each had wide bands strapped to their wrists. The bands were attached to tubes to some sort of machine with gauges. A thick fluid was pulsing through the tubes and into needles stuck into each child's wrist. The machine was the source of the crimson glow. Slowly, ever so slowly, the youngsters turned. Alex felt his jaw drop. It was like looking into a mirror. He was standing face to face with the exact likeness of Amy and himself. "What is happening? What is happening?" the image repeated. It was like listening to his own voice. Alex felt dizzy. "This is impossible. This is impossible," repeated his double. "Not really," said a voice behind them. Alex reeled around to lock eyes with Clara. She had Amy by the shoulder. It was quite simple, in fact. It only took a few moments for the duplicator to produce the shells. All I needed was something to animate them. A sample of hair, a little blood, a couple of, well, let's call them volunteers. She held up a handful of golden white fur. It was stained with dry blood. "Castor and Pollux," Amy moaned. "Yes, you were quite right, Alex. You did hear them this morning. I couldn't very well let you open the closet door and see them halfway through their transition. But now, it's almost complete, and they will soon take your places quite nicely. Even your parents won't know the difference. No one will ever suspect that you are missing. Other parents will continue to hire me to babysit, and I can go on with my captures without interruption. Now, are you ready to go?" "Not with you!" With some reserve of strength, Alex charged across the room and knocked Clara off her balance. He grabbed his sister's hand. "Let's get out of here!" Together they raced to the front door. Alex fumbled for a moment with the lock, then yanked it open, but... Outside, Clara loomed above them in the doorway. Behind her was what looked like a bizarre craft of some sort. Its edges were vague, and it was bathed in the same reddish glow that had been seen in Clara's room. "You might as well come along quietly," Clara said. "It really won't be so bad. You have a nice habitat all prepared for you. I think you'll like the exercise wheel. It'll keep you occupied until you reach your final destination." Alex felt his will seeping away. "Who are you? Where are you taking us?" We're hunters, Clara answered simply. We come from out there. She gestured toward the constellation Gemini. Don't worry. We already have plenty more of your kind to keep you company for the trip. In fact, there are hundreds of our clever replacements already in position. You tasty little morsels will not be missed. She grinned widely, exposing a mouthful of dagger-like teeth. Alex watched as the door to the craft yawned silently open. There are more of you? He asked. Is that how you could be in the garden with Amy and in your room at the same time? Oh no, that was a simple projection in the garden, an illusion. There are indeed more of us, dozens in fact, but I am quite special, you see. Clara beamed with pride as she nudged Amy and Alex along. I only hunt pairs. Now hurry along, we don't want to be late for dinner. Ooh, we went aliens, folks. We went aliens. Oh, goodness. Aliens. Let's see what you guys are saying. Let's see. Here we go. Keith Tomlin, a special pair, I'm in. Evan McMahon said, I've always loved the names Castor and Pollux. That's my first time hearing it, but of course I'm a high school dropout. Shane Migliavaca, vampire babysitter? That was my first thought too when I saw the blood. I guess they're kind of space vampires? Oh God, he said, can't unsee Nick Cage as the hamster now. Keith Tomlin said, lost hamsters? Would it be bad taste to make a Richard Gere joke? Whoa! Morgan Moore said, this is certainly a weird one. I would agree. Dwayne West, I really love the story. I'm an identical twin myself, so it makes the story even cooler. That is true. Yes, I've met your I think I've met your twin. Or have I? Michelle Antisocial said, it's a cookbook! And then Alex Harker said, spoopy! That was a weird one, folks. Let's get a little of this going. Not a bad story. I liked it. Let's see. Yep, everything's good. So far, so good. So, I guess we'll go to the next one. Sorry, my voice is getting a little sore. Also, there was a firecracker that went off during the story that, I hope it didn't scare my dogs too much. Well, Henwolf is scared of basically nothing, but Chicano gets very freaked out by fireworks, so I'm keeping an ear out. If I hear them at the door, I may have to go check on them real quick. But hopefully there aren't any more fireworks right now. So, let's see what's next in our story list. All right. Ooh. This story is called The Gunslinger. Comstock City was one of the most famous frontier towns of the American West, and Chris prided himself on knowing all of the details of its incredible history. Chris and his buddies Michael and Eddie often took a shortcut through the old cemetery on the way home from Comstock Middle School, and Chris would tell his friends the legends of the men and women who rested beneath the worn tombstones. Like everyone else in town, Michael and Eddie were already familiar with most of the stories, but Chris had become a real expert. His favorite tales were of the outlaws, brutal gunslingers who had terrorized the town a century before. One very fierce gang had been feared throughout the territory. Their leader, D.B. Rance, had had a particularly evil career. Rance had killed 7 men by the time he was 18. He's the meanest of anybody here in this cemetery, Chris assured his friends. The boys had stopped at the side of Rance's grave. He even killed men who had dropped to their knees begging for their lives. Chris saw that this made an impression on the other boys. But he was a coward, too. He was known for shooting people in the back. Michael studied the grave. Wasn't he killed in a shootout? Chris loved the attention of his friends, and he played it up for all it was worth. He tucked his thumbs in his belt loops and placed one foot against the tombstone. Yeah, he was gunned down, him and his whole gang. Rance was the first one to go. He got a bullet right between the eyes and dropped where he stood. But they're all here. Chris made a sweeping gesture with his hand toward the back of the cemetery grounds. Eddie shivered. Hey, you guys, it's starting to get late. We don't want to be here after dark. Chris smirked. Why not? You're not afraid of anything in here, are you? Come on, Chris. Michael picked his bike up from the ground where he'd left it. Eddie's right. I don't believe you guys, Chris laughed. These jerks are dead. I'm not afraid of them. I wouldn't even have been afraid of them if they were alive. He made his point by kicking at Rance's aged gravestone. You better not do that, Chris, Eddie warned. Chris cocked his head. Why not? I really don't believe you guys. You're chicken, afraid of a dead man. You wouldn't say that if he were standing right in front of you, Eddie shot back. Sure I would, said Chris. If I'd have lived here 100 years ago, I would have been even meaner than D.B. Rance. I would have joined his gang. No, I probably would have been the leader of his gang. Excitedly, Chris turned to face the grave. Do you hear that, D.B. Rance? I'm not afraid of you. If you're so tough, I challenge you to a battle right here and now. Chris stood defiantly, his fists clenched. He had always secretly wished that he could have lived in the days of the Old West. He thought it would have been great to have him march down the center of a dusty street while the townspeople fled for cover, to have faced down an opponent and waited for the right second to draw his gun. The boys stood barely breathing. The only sound was the creaking of the leafless branch of a huge dead tree beside the grave. Finally, Chris laughed. You see? He felt a thrill, as though he'd actually won a battle. I told you, Rance is a coward. Like you said, he's dead, Michael muttered. Chris laughed again. If he was everything that some people around here say he was, even that wouldn't stop him. He's a coward and a phony. To make his point, Chris kicked at the gravestone again, but since it had been raining a lot lately, the ground was soft. This time the thin stone quivered slightly, and a small chunk fell off the top and landed with a sickening thud. Just then the wind picked up unexpectedly, and the tree branches overhead swayed and groaned. Chris was startled. To cover his sudden fear, he bent down and picked up the small, ragged-edged piece of stone. It felt cold and heavy in his hands. I'll just keep this as a souvenir. Maybe you better not take it, Chris, Eddie advised nervously. Maybe you should put it back. Chris slipped the stone into his backpack and swaggered over to his bike. Who's gonna make me? He tilted his head toward the grave. Him? Once they were away from the cemetery, Michael and Eddie quickly got over their fear. By the time the boys reached their block, they were all laughing about how Chris had bested that 2-bit gunslinger. I guess he couldn't have been all that tough, Michael admitted, or he wouldn't have gotten caught in an ambush. Yeah, I'd never let anybody sneak up on me, Chris boasted as he opened the front gate to his yard. As he stepped inside and pulled the gate closed, he caught sight of something in the soft dirt beside the path. It was a fresh print, a big one, a boot print. Chris stared at the print for a moment, trying to decide who might have made it. Then he realized that his friends were already pedaling off down the street. See you tomorrow, he yelled after them. After dinner, he told his mom he had lots of homework and headed upstairs to his room to read the newest issue of his favorite comic book, Spook Mansion. He flopped down on his bed and had barely started the first story about a boy trapped in a haunted fun park when his mom called out. Chris! He pretended not to hear her. Chris! She called a little louder. I know you can hear me. You promised to take out the trash right after dinner. He sighed and still didn't answer. Chris! All right, I'll be there in a minute, he called. Not in a minute. Not in a minute. Right now, young man. Chris could tell by the tone of his mother's voice that it would be a good idea to do as she asked. Grumbling, he tossed the comic aside and stomped half-heartedly downstairs. His mother was waiting for him. And when you're finished, you can get your homework and do it down here on the table instead of barricading yourself in your room to read comic books, she said firmly. I wasn't reading comic books, Chris lied. wondering how she always knew. He pulled on his jacket and grabbed the plastic bag sitting beside the kitchen table, then shoved open the screen door and let it slam behind him. Still muttering, he shuffled out into the backyard and to the alley gate. It was always pretty deserted in his neighborhood at night. There was a streetlight just a few feet from the gate, but he still didn't like being alone in the alley. He hurriedly lifted the lid on the metal trash can and threw a bag of garbage inside and slammed the lid down. As soon as he turned toward the open gate again, he noticed a tall figure at the darkened end of the alley. His heart began to race, but for some reason Chris couldn't seem to move his feet. The shadow walked very slowly and deliberately toward him. He could hear the dull sound of boot heels hitting the dusty pavement. Chris lowered his eyes, terrified to look at the approaching figure, but somehow he knew who it was. "Please don't be him," he moaned. But when Chris raised his eyes again, he felt a wave of horror flood over him. He was looking at the cruel face of D.B. Rance. It was the same evil face that he had seen in old pictures and local tourist guides, but with one difference. Unlike in the pictures, there was a neat, black hole right between the gunslinger's eyes, an ugly wound from the bullet that had ended his life a century before. The Phantom stopped a few feet away and locked his cold eyes on Chris. He was dressed in faded clothes and a worn, rotting leather jacket. He pushed his jacket back on one side, and Chris could see a shining pistol strapped to his left hip. Rance held his left arm so that his hand was only inches from the gun. His fingers, curled up like claws, were twitching as if he couldn't wait to use the weapon once more. Chris looked down at his own trembling hands. A ghost can't hurt me," he said aloud, trying to convince himself. "He isn't real." Chris stole a look at the gate. It was open. He tried with all his might to run, but his terror held him anchored to one spot. Rance twisted his mouth into a terrible grin and spoke. "What's the matter, boy? You a coward or something? I don't think there's anything I hate worse than a coward, unless it's a thief and a coward." Chris saw the specter's hand flinch, and he forced himself to move. He made a clumsy, stumbling dive for the gate and landed face down in the alley. Afraid to look up, he crawled along, trying to escape the gruesome ghost of D.B. Rance. Suddenly, Chris realized that it wasn't the blacktop of the alley that he was dragging himself across, but dirt. He dug his fingers around handfuls of old clay. The only sound was the creaking branches in the wind. Finally, Chris opened his eyes. He didn't know how it had happened, but he was stretched across the cold earth of the cemetery, and he wasn't alone. As frightened as he was, Chris recognized all the figures standing around him. Rufus Thomas, Hayworth Wiesner, Kevin O'Donnell, all men who had died that day with D.B. Rance. Even Jack Payton, the only gang member to have survived the gun battle, stood staring at him. Chris saw the deep red mark on the rope on the ghost's pale neck. Slowly, Chris raised himself to his knees, then to his feet. The phantoms didn't move. Gathering his courage, Chris whirled around and raced toward the cemetery fence. He didn't get far. D.B. Rance stepped from behind the old dead tree and stood directly in his path. The wind howled and the dried branches of the tree trembled like long-fingered hands reaching up into the sky. Chris could hear the ancient wood snapping and cracking. He fell to his knees beside the gravestone that he had kicked over earlier. He remembered Eddie's words. "You wouldn't say that if he were here standing right in front of you." "I didn't mean any of what I said," Chris sobbed. The gunfighter eased toward him like a predator. The phantom gang looked on silently. Chris could smell dampness and decay as the thing crouched down, put its face right next to his, and touched the barrel of a Colt 45 to Chris's head. "You took something of mine," Rance growled. Chris cringed at his rancid breath. "Nobody steals from me." Chris peered up into the horrible eyes and backed away, just slightly. As he moved, he felt the weight of something in his jacket pocket. He slipped his trembling fingers inside, pulled the broken piece of gravestone from his pocket, and held it in the palm of his outstretched hand. Slowly, The gunslinger reached out and took it. Chris felt the icy, cold brush of the dead man's hand. "Please," Chris begged. "You've got what you want, now let me go!" He had to yell above the sound of the wind. Above him, the tree branches whipped back and forth as if trying to escape from the ghostly gunslinger too. Rance laughed and the others joined him. The hideous noise nearly drowned out the rising moan of the wind and the thrashing of the tree branches. With a savage look on his face, Rance pulled back the hammer of his gun. Chris stiffened. The wail of the wind continued to rise as Rance squeezed the trigger. Chris heard a loud crack. For a moment, everything seemed to spin around him. Then it was still again, and Chris became aware that he was still crouching on the ground. "I'm all right," he mumbled, half stunned. He can't really hurt me." Without looking back, Chris rose unsteadily to his feet. Willing his legs to move, he made a mad dash for the fence at the edge of the graveyard, but the fence didn't get any closer. No matter how hard he ran, he seemed to be staying in the same place. In total terror, Chris spun around and saw Rance and the other spirits grinning wickedly. Rance was standing over a lifeless body, stretched limply across the gunslinger's grave. In horror, Chris saw that it was his own. One of the massive rotten branches from the tree above the grave had finally splintered in the wind and fallen, hitting him on the head. Rance snarled, "Hey boys, looks like we have a new member in the gang." He threw back his head in a shriek of horrible laughter as the wind rose and whipped away both the sounds of laughter and Chris's screams. I didn't see that ending coming. That was some good stuff. Let's see what you kids were saying. All right. Keith Tomlin said, 7 men by the time he was 18? Pfft, amateur. Shane Migliavacca said, "Well, now you done it. You're dead, kid." And Morgan Moore said, "I am all for cowboy zombies." Cowboy zombies are pretty great. I'm not going to lie. Actually, right now, in my personal reading list, speaking of zombie cowboys, I'm reading a book written by my friend David Mollet called Sleep with the Scorpions. That's Sleep with the Scorpions. It's available on Amazon, via ebook. You can read it on your Kindle or your phone or your tablet. But it's called Sleep with the Scorpions. And it's kind of like The Crow, but in a western town. And there is a cowboy zombie in it. And I'm about halfway through it, and I'm really enjoying it. It's a novella, so it's not a very long read, but I take a while. Keith Tomlin said, about time. Some youngins gotta die. I mean, it wouldn't be Uncle Henny's Campfire Stories without some children reaching their horrible fate, particularly cocky children who make the mistake of going on vacation or moving into a new house or going to a graveyard or making a new friend. I mean, there's such a long list of things you just shouldn't do that these books make very clear. Morgan Moore said, "You had me at like The Crow." It's a bit like The Crow. I'm enjoying it a lot. So yeah, it's called Sleep with the Scorpions by David Mollet. I think you really get a kick out of it. Sherman Hirsch. That's not how it happened. He left out the part about the... I don't know what the joke was. Keith Tomlin said, "That's what I appreciates about you." Well, thank you. So, let's see. I guess, my friends, we probably got about one more story for the night. My throat's getting a little tender, and I've got to check on the dogs, too. Henwolf is doing well, but she still has stitches and stuff. I got to make sure she's all good. But this next story is one for the record books, and I feel bad for anybody who is tuned out, because this story is probably going to be the classiest one we've ever read on the show. This is a story that I have a feeling is going to have all of the subtlety, class, and nuance you've come to expect from scary stories to tell for sleepovers. Excuse me. So here we go, my friends. Final story of the night. A real classic. Probably, this is almost Shakespeare. This story is called The Slime Mutants of Clear Lake. Diane pulled on her favorite sweatshirt. It was so faded and worn that the message on the front, "Make Earth Day every day," was barely readable. As she was closing her backpack, the door to her room opened and her mom leaned in. "Mr. Carter is outside in the van," she said, smiling. "Are you ready?" "You bet," Diane answered happily. She had been looking forward to this weekend at Clear Lake for weeks. "Don't forget to pack your medicine," her mom reminded her. "I'm still not sure you're well enough to go." "Mom, my cold is almost gone. I promised to stay warm." Diane had worked hard to convince her parents that she should be allowed to go on the trip. Mr. Carter, the science teacher, often took the Earth Science Club on field trips, but this would be the first time they were going to camp out. Besides, it was sort of a celebration, too. Until last year, Clear Lake had not deserved its name. It had been a dumping site for all sorts of trash and who knows what else from the nearby town. Diane's Science Club had been part of a special effort to stop the dumping and clean up the lake. Cold or no cold, this field trip was a must. The trip up the mountain road took only a couple of hours. At the campsite, Mr. Carter and the 8 kids quickly set up their tents. Since it was still early in the season, there were no other campers around, so the group had its choice of the best sites close to the lake. "Who wants to go for a swim?" Paul Kelly called out, appearing at the opening to his tent wearing his swimsuit. "That sounds like a great idea," Mr. Carter agreed. "But I have to gather some kindling and set up our fire pit first. I don't want anyone going into the water unless I'm with you." Everyone groaned. I can find kindling," Diane chimed in. "I still have a cold and I can't go swimming." "That's very nice of you, Diane," said Mr. Carter. "Okay, you're in charge of setting up the fire." Within minutes, the rest of the group was splashing knee-deep in the cold water. Paul, Terry, and Josh were the first to dive in. Each surfaced a few yards from shore, sputtering and shivering. It's not so cold out here," Terry lied. "Come on!" "Be careful," Mr. Carter warned. "The rocks on the bottom are covered with algae and can be slippery." "Cool," Diane's best friend Sarah said, slipping on her diving mask and snorkel. "I'll see what else is down there." She eased out a little deeper into the lake, studying the rocks beneath that were carpeted with delicate strands of algae. She dived down and picked up a long, flat rock to get a better look at it. Gripping it in one hand, she cringed when it started to wriggle. Then she felt a nip at her fingers, and the object squirmed out of her grasp. Sarah's startled scream took the form of a stream of bubbles heading for the surface. She whirled in the water and followed the bubbles up. Then she swam to the shallows where Mr. Carter, Lisa, and Bill were gathering water samples in jars. "Mr. Carter," Sarah gasped, pushing her mask to her forehead. "I picked up this rock and it was all slimy. It moved. It really did. And it bit me." She held up her hand to show a tiny drop of blood at the tip of her finger. "Calm down, Sarah," the teacher said soothingly. "The algae makes the rock slippery. You probably just dropped it." "No, sir," she shook her head. "It wiggled back and forth and tried to get away." Lisa looked up from filling a jar. "It was probably a fish. You know, one of those flatfish that live on the bottom. You just thought it was a rock." "Flatfish don't usually bite," whined Sarah. "And besides, it was covered all over with this weird stringy-looking algae." "You mean like this?" Paul waded toward them. He was holding a handful of slimy green stuff. Long strands of it dripped between his fingers. "What is it, Mr. Carter?" The science teacher ripped off a bit of the weird plant and looked at it very closely. "I'm not sure." He reached into his shoulder backpack, took out a plastic box, and put the small algae sample inside. "We'll have to take it back with us and try to find out what it is," he said, tucking the box into his pack. "Look!" Sarah pointed to where the bushes were growing right along the shoreline. "It's over there, too!" Algae covered the lower branches of the bushes. Their leaves were furry with it, and strings of the emerald-colored slime clung to the branches that overhung the lake. "That's strange," Lisa said. She stood up and sloshed towards the bushes. "It seems to be growing just as well out of the water as in it." As she stood examining the strands, something drifted out from under a branch and gently bumped her leg. "Gross!" she screamed and backpedaled several steps. "Mr. Carter, look at this!" The body of a large dead duck was floating in the water. Most of its feathers were covered with a fine layer of algae. The longest strands hung from its open beak. Bill whistled softly. Whoa, that stuff must grow fast. Do you think it's poison? Maybe the duck tried to eat it. Mr. Carter shook his head, then looked at the lengthening shadows on the shore. I don't know what to make of it, but I think it's best if we all get out of the water. We'll come back out in the morning. He rubbed his hands on his shorts. And when we get back, I'll warm up a tub of water. I want you all to wash your hands really well. Paul nodded. Yeah, this stuff is kind of sticky. Excited from their adventure in the lake, the club members trooped into camp, laughing and chattering. Diane had gathered an impressive pile of kindling and had set up the fire pit. How was the water? She said cheerily. Great, Josh answered, except for the attack of the mutant green slime. Everyone laughed. Diane raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Josh grinned. Nothing. There's just this strange stuff growing in the lake. After everything that was dumped in there over the years, it's no surprise. Yuck, and you were swimming in it? Diane said, wrinkling up her nose. Now I'm not sorry I didn't go. Anyway, the fire's ready to be lit. And you did a fine job, Mr. Carter added. I don't know about all of you, but I'm hungry. Who wants to eat? The answer was a general cheer. While the other kids changed into dry clothes, Diane scouted around the edge of the clearing for more wood. She noticed a small branch sticking out from under a clump of bushes. As she slid it out, a squirrel scurried out from under one of the bushes. Hi, little guy, she said. Sorry if... Her words froze in her throat. The squirrel had turned and bared its long, chisel-like teeth at her. Then it made a strange hissing noise, as if it were trying to growl. Diane had never seen a squirrel behave like that. Even in the deepening shadows of twilight, she could see clearly enough to realize that she had never seen a squirrel that looked like this one either. Its glistening fur was a patchwork of deep emerald green, and strands of slime hung loosely from its snout. The small creature lunged. Diane jumped back and fell out of its way as it dashed back into the undergrowth. Wow, Diane whispered in awe. She stood up slowly, dusted herself off, and decided not to mention the incident to the others. No one would believe that she had been attacked by a vicious green squirrel anyway. By the time the full moon had risen, there was a blazing fire in the pit, and everyone was roasting hot dogs. It was a clear, crisp night, and Diane pushed any thoughts of the strange squirrel out of her mind. Until Lisa mentioned the strange algae and the dead duck they had found floating in the lake. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen before, Lisa whispered. The stuff seemed to be growing in patches. Yuck, I can't believe I touched it. Absent-mindedly, she reached down and scratched above her ankle, the spot where the duck had bumped into her. Something about Lisa's hand caught Diane's eye. What have you got under your fingernails? She asked. Lisa looked at her fingernails, then turned her leg toward the fire and slowly pulled up the pant leg of her jeans. Both girls gasped. A large patch of green fuzz covered the side of Lisa's calf and ankle. Mr. Carter, Diane said, her voice quivering, I think you should look at this. The science teacher came over and knelt down to examine Lisa's leg. But just then, Paul jumped up and dropped his hot dog into the fire. Look! The palms of both his hands were covered with fine green strands, and there were green stains between his fingers. Even as they all watched, the stains became slightly fuzzy. Paul grabbed a handful of dirt and rubbed his hands together frantically. What is it, Mr. Carter? It hurts, he wailed. Lisa rubbed at her leg. Sarah started to cry when she, too, found large greenish stains forming on her hands. Don't panic, Mr. Carter tried to calm them. It must be some kind of allergic reaction. I have some medication that should help. He grabbed his shoulder pack and flipped open the top. Inside, the plastic sample box had come open, and everything was covered with slimy green algae. What the... Mr. Carter dropped the bag and began to rub at his own hands. Dark stains were spreading up his arms. I don't know what's going on here, but we need to get help. Everybody, get into the van. We've got to get into town. The keys... He felt in his pockets. Diane could tell from his voice that something was terribly wrong with him. He was losing control. Where are the keys? He screamed. They must be here. He picked up the shoulder pack, turned it over, and dumped the contents on the ground. Like everything else, the keys to the van were coated in slime. Mr. Carter dropped to his knees and grabbed for them in the dirt. But before he could reach them, Sarah kicked the keys into the fire. Mr. Carter, Diane screamed, pointing at Sarah. What's happening to her? Sarah stood grinning beside the fire. Long strands of green slime hung from her lips. When she opened her mouth to speak, she sputtered and drooled. The slime was obviously growing inside her mouth, too. Nothing is happening to me, Sarah said, turning to face Diane. Or at least, nothing that concerns you. Yet. But I can fix that. She reached out her ooze-covered hand. Diane squirmed away while the other kids gathered behind Sarah. Diane looked from one to the other. Every one of them was spotted with large patches of grotesque green stuff. The rancid odor stung Diane's nostrils. Tears filled her eyes. Sarah, you're my best friend. What are you doing? I just want to hold hands, friend. Diane moaned. What is wrong with you? With all of you? Stop whining, you little brat! Mr. Carter stood up and shuffled toward her. In the firelight, she could see that he was baring his teeth, now sharp and pointed like the squirrel's had been. This slime, whatever it is changing you, Diane sobbed. I'll get help. She scrambled to her feet and backed away toward the forest. I can make it to town. It's not so far. She continued to babble as they all moved closer and closer. I'll get you help. Suddenly, a form grabbed at her from the shadows. Who says we want help? A slime-covered being snarled at what sounded like Josh's voice. Diane twisted away from its grasp. Stumbling and crying, she raced into the forest. Twigs and branches seemed to reach out for her. They scraped at her face and hands as she lurched forward. She could hear the others following close behind. Which way was the main road? In the pale moonlight, she saw a clearing ahead and changed course toward it. She ran out into the open space and stood gasping for air. Suddenly there was a screech from above, and a creature dived at her from the sky. The horrible slime dripped from its widespread wings and sharp talons, which Diane barely managed to dodge. Only the creature's glowing eyes were free of the stuff. From its piercing cry, she could tell that the thing had once been an owl. It turned to attack again, and Diane ducked back into the trees. She waited until the screeches finally died down. The silence settled in like a fog, and the entire forest seemed to press close around her. Where are they? She whispered. Then she caught a scent in the air. It was a dank, musty smell, and it was growing stronger. Then she saw something glinting through the leaves just a few yards away. It was the remains of their campfire. I've doubled back to the lake, she moaned. Diane edged around the dense vegetation and neared the rocky shore. Now she could hear the low growls of the monsters that had once been her friends. They were coming closer. Frantically, she looked from side to side. There was nowhere to run. She glanced fearfully at the calm water. They had said the slime was in the water, but that was further down the shore. Maybe the lake was all right here. Step by step, she carefully worked her way over the rocks and eased into the icy lake up to her knees. The water glittered in the moonlight. It didn't feel slippery. The sound of something heavy lumbering over the rocks forced her to make a decision. She silently slipped under the overhanging branch and hid among the shadows. The water, now up to her neck, was so cold that it was painful, but she bit her lip and didn't make a sound. Snuffling and grunting, several of the horrid creatures limped along the shore. They seemed to be communicating with one another, but no human sound emerged. Diane shrank back into the darkness. Her heart was pounding so hard that she was afraid they might hear it. One of the creatures stepped close enough that she could have reached out and touched its slime-slick leg. Diane held her breath and squeezed her eyes shut. She was barely aware of the low-growing leaves and twigs that scratched her face as she withdrew further among the branches. Finally, the hideous beasts hobbled away over the rocks. Diane waited until everything was silent. Then she groped her way out of the water. Her feet were almost numb with the cold, but she ran. Within moments, she stumbled out onto the narrow dirt road that the group had traveled to reach the campsite. She raced downhill and finally reached the main highway. Every breath was agony as she continued to flee down the center of the pavement, afraid to wander too near the dense forest on either side. She knew only too well what the terrible secrets the trees were hiding were. All at once, she realized that there was something behind her, something drawing near. She whirled around. and stared into what looked like two huge gleaming eyes. "Miss, wait! Don't be afraid! What are you doing out here alone?" The owner of the voice stepped closer. Diane was able to make out a tall woman in a uniform. The gleaming eyes were the headlights of a car. She felt faint and sensed the ground under her feet start to spin. A moment later, someone was wrapping a jacket around her and helping her into a car. As her head cleared, she realized that it was a highway patrol car. The officer who was driving was speaking into the mouthpiece of his police radio. "I don't know," he was saying. "Her clothes are all damp. I imagine she'd been in the lake. We'll bring her in first, then head on back to check whether anyone else is around." He finished his call and looked on into his rearview mirror at Diane. "Well, young lady, are you feeling okay? Can you tell us what happened to you?" Diane opened her mouth, but she couldn't seem to make a sound. "Don't worry, honey," the female officer said kindly. "Whatever happened, you're safe now." The woman reached under her seat, pulled out a small bag, and fished out a compact and some tissues. "Here you go. Dry your eyes and try to rub some of that dirt from your face. It'll make you feel better. We'll be in town in a few minutes." Diane took the tissues and dabbed at her eyes. Opening the lighted compact, she began to clear the dirt from her face. Then she felt a low scream rising in her throat. She rubbed harder and harder at the dark, greenish stain on her cheek, but it wouldn't go away. It only got bigger and bigger. Ah! Nice. Let's see. Keith Tomlin. Morgan Moore said 11:10 just for the title. I have to agree. That's probably the most fantastic title we've ever had. Heather Fairchild, this story gives me a combination of Creepshow vibes. I would agree. It's definitely got a Jordy Verrill sense to it. And some body horror. We don't have a ton of body horror in these kids' books. And then Keith Tomlin said, anyone else hungry? Maybe some lime jello? Oh, Keith, always inappropriate, always ready to rock. So thank you, Keith. Well, I want to thank you guys for hanging out. I'm sorry I couldn't go the full 2 hours, but honestly, it's been so hard on my throat. I've been kind of going easy on myself and letting myself not wreck my voice entirely. But I appreciate you guys hanging out tonight. I'll be back next Wednesday right here on Facebook, and we'll read some more scary stories. And again, also huge thanks to those of you who dropped a tip in. It really makes a difference. I am slowly but surely getting back to work, kind of. And the tips really do help a lot. So I really do appreciate it. This week's tips are also going to go to Henwolf's vet bills because they're sizable, but she's doing very well. And next Wednesday, I'll give you an update because next Wednesday, Henwolf will have her cone removed and her stitches and staples taken out. So I'll be able to give you guys an update. If you didn't know already, I have a podcast called Weekly Spooky, which is not friendly for kids, but it is a podcast called Weekly Spooky. So if you love listening to audio stories, go to weeklyspooky.com and you can subscribe, listen, and have a good time. I will see you guys next Wednesday. Thank you again so much. Shane Migliavaca said that was a good one. I feel like Shane would like a slimy story. Oh, by the way, if you go to weeklyspooky.com right now, you can listen to me narrate one of Shane's newest stories called Father's Day. And it is excellent, by the way. So anyway, my friends, on that note, thank you again. Have a great night. Stay safe. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. And I will be back next week. So rock and roll. Thank you, guys.